So essentially what you want to do is find the fonts that you want to edit or play around with. Sans serif here. I'll play this one. I'm going to download that one. Open up the zip file. Double click. Here's lemon. This one's called lemon milk, I guess. We're looking for the OTF or TTF files. So these are all OTF files. One of them is bold, bold italic, etc. I'm just going to copy these and put them into my font folder. So select both of these, copy. I think I have a fonts folder down here. Fonts, paste them in. Double click. I just want to double click on the OTF or TTF file, and then you can hit install font. I'm pretty sure it works the exact same way in a PC. Does anyone have a PC that would be willing to try this? Make sure. If you have one, just double check. And then what was the other one called? Lemon milk. There it is. I will just find OTF and TTF files. You can select them all, double click, install font. And that will install them all. What's awesome too is that you don't have to like restart the program or anything. They'll just be immediately searchable. So here's a font. I can go right to my character window, lemon milk right there. That's kind of a nice font anyway. But go ahead and choose to write something. So here's my name. First of all, I want to mess with the kerning. You can click as if you're going to type in that space. You can hold down the Option key or Alt key and tuck those letters in. I think there's some opportunities where I could mess around with the end caps of these. Change the shapes or form of them. I'll just make a copy. I can go in with the type option, type menu, choose create outlines. Converted to outlines now. I'll just make lots of copies of these so I can play around with them. You could free transform draw on these, by the way. So if one way that you didn't want to work was with a pen tool necessarily, let's say I wanted to extend this H a little bit, I can just sort of free draw on that letter H. The problem is that that becomes a permanent change in the letter. So if I just draw sort of shapes or something to change that form, I can always go back and change it later. But what might be kind of fun, if I can go to the shapes that I accidentally made, I can find some shapes through this process too. Get a couple of these shapes. And let's see if maybe I can change the end caps of my name to have a little bit more of like a diamond on them. See what happens. Already looks like a fruit leaf or something. That's kind of fun. Kind of a fun little mark there. Just make this wider. Looks better. Maybe I can round the corners. So many fun ways that you can like edit these fonts, you know? Kind of a more interesting end cap already. So end caps are one of the things that we can change about Letterform. And again, I'm not really editing anything on the letters themselves. I'm just trying to find a way to sort of freely, loosely kind of add shapes. So I'm working additively first. You can also subtract things. That doesn't quite work, does it? That way, maybe. Have to play around with this one a little bit, but a lot of fun. And I know that if I practice this a few times, I'm going to get better at it. And that's the whole idea that we want to try today. Just practice editing, adding to Letterforms. Or it might be kind of fun to not start with a font. We'll just play around with like this shape right here. Let's add a little symmetry to this one. There's already like a letter A right there, or a nice start to a letter V, or a nice start to like a letter M. Or a letter N even. Have them. It's a real word. Have them, and there's an opportunity there to sort of explore things, play around with individual shapes. You'll come up with more unique versions of letters than you would have if you were just relying on sketching. Worth the practice. So I can make a letter H out of these. And of course, none of these are going to be perfect, right? It's just the idea. Getting the idea of the practice down. That's a rather nice letter H. Kind of fun. Opportunity there. Can go in and like sort of round the corners or something if I wanted to. That's already an also fun H. Rounding the corners, by the way, is just selecting your white arrow tool A on the keyboard, then going in and finding those little white nodules there, and you can click and drag them. That'll sort of round the corners. Pretty good. Maybe I can take this piece here that I just made and then make some more Lego blocks out of it. Rotation process, I'll go through this one more time. Rotate tool, which is R on your keyboard. Click where you want to rotate around from. You can choose inside the letter or outside the letter, totally up to you. Hold down the Option key to make a copy. Click and drag on the shape to make that copy. Sort of do something like that. And once you've made one copy, hold down the Command or Control button and hit the letter D. Each time you do that, it's just going to rotate around. Made some nice like abstract flower shape, which is fun. Ooh, but look at all these interesting shapes in the middle. That is going to be fun. There's some cool ones. Some of them are round, some of them are not. I'm going to go ahead and click on the Divide button in my Pathfinder. Ungroup it, Shift Command G, and now I can click on and select these little pieces out of here. There's a nice little like end cap or something from a letter. Get these little pieces out of here. The idea here is to just use the pieces as building blocks. See if you can make something out of them. You can always add symmetry with the Symmetry tool, which is the Reflect tool. The hotkey is O. If I get like a cool shape, that's how I flipped this line here for the N and the M. Can make like a W out of both of these. So here I'll make like this shape. Flip it upside down. I can go to the Rotate tool or the Reflect tool, which is O. Double click on the tool and choose which way I want to flip it. We'll say horizontal there. Click OK. I can double stack. Maybe one of these double stack W's would be nice. So there I'm starting to almost develop a font. You know, it doesn't have a use yet. It doesn't have a style. It's still just one flat sort of single color, just built out of concentric shapes. But it's so much opportunity for me to explore freely, either by editing fonts or by messing around and sort of free building these kind of abstract shapes on accident. If anyone needs the steps, I think I wrote them out already. Here you go. Make a shape, rotate tool, click to set the rotation point, click and drag to set the shape to rotate. Then Command D. Oops, you need to hold Alt. In fact, I'll pause there just for a minute if anyone wants to screenshot that or something. You certainly can. Any questions about these processes so far? How to go in and edit fonts to make them editable? Things like this, I can extend the line here. Hold down my pen tool, click and drag while holding down the Option key to make round areas. And that is all because this is now an editable font. I don't have to worry about line width. I don't have to get like perfect precision with my forms. It's a little bit of a different process than building with custom lettering. Gives me an opportunity to add or take away from. Remember, you can use your Pathfinder feature to cut letters. So let's say I wanted to just cut them all right here. Find a line and where it overlaps those lettering, select both that and the lettering, choose the divide feature, ungroup it. Now, stylistically, I can, take the tops off of these letters here. A way to treat the letter. Give you an opportunity to build something unique. This might be a nice, cool letter to base off of as well, for like a letter V or a letter M. There's kind of a stylized W. Oh, that looks like Wario, doesn't it? Like a Wario W. Mario M. That end's a little bit too thick, but that's a great start, right? Kind of fun. There's a line thickness, but I need to cut this. Here's a good opportunity. It's kind of a cool X. Maybe I'll make another copy of that. Use the divide feature. Yeah, move this one. Move this one up. Out of it. Yeah. I might need to make some more space on this side. Oh gosh. Subtract these points here. I can extend this. If you do extend one line, here's a little trick. If the guides are on, if you go to Window and choose Smart Guides, you can turn those on. If you want to try and pull just a line in one direction, do you see how it's making that left-hand line purple? That's helping me keep it perfectly aligned so that I know it's just an extension. And oops, there it's off in the purple, there it's back on. So I'm not like changing the shape of anything. I'm using the smart guides to help me sort of draw that line in the right direction. I just need these to overlap. So there's the purple. A little bit maybe too tall of a letter N. Extend this on this side a little bit, but kind of fun. Starting to just free build a little bit in Illustrator. And again, the idea here is I'm not putting any pressure on you in the results. I'm not trying to do that by any means. I just want you to practice. I hope that doesn't seem like it's a waste of time by any means. Practice can help so much to help you improve your workflow. And honestly, you can come up with a lot of cool stuff this way. Just fill that in a little bit. I don't know if that's like the right end, but well, I mean, this is almost like making some fonts and stuff, right? So I've got an X, I've got an N. And look, it's just built out of a bunch of just like random triangles, squares, rectangles, whatever it is. I don't know if I like that X though. I have to come up with a different X. This might be better if I tuck these in. Again, view and smart objects is pretty helpful. Be a little pull on the points. Is that a better X? I don't know. Maybe. Command G to group things together. That way it doesn't move separated. Those are some fun letters. Sans serif, right? Start with sans serif before we move to serifs. So play around. If you have an Illustrator available to you, I recommend playing around with some of these things in that space. All right, I'm going to show you how to create some similar looking shapes in Photoshop, if that's okay. Those of you that are working in Procreate or in Photoshop or any of those other types of programs, let's switch over to this tool just in case. I'd love to show you a little bit of a process how you can make interesting shapes in geometry. And I hope that this is a really useful step in the process, because in Photoshop and Procreate, there's so many amazing textured brushes, so much opportunity for adding organic elements. And what I mean by that is things that sort of seem random or sort of inspired by nature. Things are not, perfectly symmetrical by any means. Geometry is different, right? It's sort of the counter to that, the complement to that. And if you can find a way to build things with really nice geometry in a space where you're easily accessible to really excellent textures and brushes and things like that, you'll find that it's going to immediately complement your work. So if everything that you draw is organic, it's going to seem like maybe a little bit of geometry is going to complement that and make it look really nice. So let me just show you a couple different ways that you can work in Photoshop. And it's all coming down to different ways to use selections to work around with things. So let me show you some of that. The basic selection tool is the marquee tool, which is M. And I'm recording this part too, if that's okay. I hope I'm not trying to make super long recordings or anything, but I hope that's helpful. Essentially, rectangle tool, click and drag to be able to make a selection of a rectangle. You can think about this in defining shape. So like I'm making a square here. I can make a new layer and then just sort of paint inside that square with my soft airbrushes, which will make a really nice kind of soft gradient and pattern. Rather than having to mess with like a gradient tool, I use brushes as much as I possibly can to make some nice sort of like gradients. I mean, you can think about, I'm making essentially a gradient map without having to mess around with gradients, right? So like whatever color I want to add into this rectangle, let's add some like pink in here or something. I can just use my airbrushes to sort of add that color. So same way to sort of work with gradient meshes, but that's a really nice way of creating a rectangle with some interesting color. It's essentially just paint on a layer, but I've used the selection to limit where that paint goes. And that creates a really beautiful form or shape. And again, the organic sort of sprayed texture of that airbrush is going to complement the geometry. So let's complicate this up just a little bit, if you're okay with that. And I think there were several of you that are into sort of making things with Photoshop or Procreate. You can make selections. I think there's a selection tool at the top, and there are geometry selection tools as well, I'm pretty sure. Correct me if I'm wrong. You're in Procreate now, right? You know where the selection tools are at? To make selections, yeah. Yeah. Okay, cool. Excellent. Now, if you're in Photoshop, you can hold down the Shift button to add to your selection. So what's really nice about this, if I wanted to make this sort of like checkered line wherever those boxes overlap with each other, that's going to create a selection. So here's a really wide but thin letter H. And what's nice about this is if I'm just sort of drawing that with rectangles, and again, I can still go in with my really soft air brushes and do these kind of like fades and things, which look really nice. When I hit Command D to deselect, I can add it different colors and sort of maybe fade it out in the center a little bit more. So really nice, again, complements the form, but makes it easy for me to build geometrically with those shapes. So again, that was with the rectangle tool, holding down the Shift key to add to that selection any type of direction. Now, it may be that we don't want to just build in right angles, right? That's not the only way we want to build. I want to build at a little bit of a different angle there. So even if I had this letter H, if I needed the next letter to be like a letter A or something, it's kind of hard to get like a direction here unless I'm going to start using some different selection tools. But let me show you another way that you can do this. Let's say I wanted to change this angle a little bit. You can actually go up to the select menu, and there's some different options up here. And the main one that I think is really kind of revolutionary is you can actually go to this transform selection space. So transform selection, it doesn't have a hotkey, so you actually have to come to the menu every time you want to do this. But what this lets me do is actually change the shape in a free-form way of whatever this shape is for the selection. I'm not actually moving any objects or any paint or any pixels on my canvas. I'm just changing the selection. What's cool about this too is that this is actually a free transform space, which if you're familiar with free transform, if you hold down the command button and I click on one of the corner pieces, I can free transform this and sort of distort it. So now I'm adding almost like a third dimension in perspective to this by just holding down the command button. Again, I haven't added any pixels or paint or anything, but makes it look like it's sort of leaning backwards into space. If I align this correctly, it'll make it look like it's sort of three-dimensional, which is pretty great. It gives me a lot of opportunity to sort of work with a selection to refine what I want to draw or paint in this sense. So here I've got sort of a three-dimensional version of that H there. I can then make sure I've got a new layer, hit enter to accept my transformation, and I can just go in and, paint whatever. add some softness to it on the edges. So that gives me an opportunity again to free transform what I want to be able to create. Now, the reason you would do this before actually free transforming the lettering is that when you paint this way, if you're working with paint in Photoshop, if you stretch the paint, it will start to pixelate a little bit. The selections can't be pixelated. They're always perfectly precise. So this gives you an opportunity to make sure that you don't accidentally pixelate whatever it is that you're working on. So if I zoom in, you'll be able to see that this has probably got like a little bit of a fuzzy edge now than it would have otherwise if I hadn't pre-transformed it. Another way to think about using these, instead of just shift, you can also subtract from shapes. So here's like a square. Let's say I wanted to take some squares out of this. Instead of holding shift, which would add to my selection, right? You can have selections that are connected or not overlapping at all. You know, I could make these all into one sort of block composition here instead of paint inside of these all in one selection go if I wanted. Right, so you can sort of fill in areas that way. Nice selection. Instead of shift, if I wanted to subtract areas, I can hold down the option key with that same M marquee tool to making selections. So option key or alt key will make a subtraction. Now I can sort of cut into whatever the shapes are that I'm trying to create here. So that is a great way to, again, to add some geometry to whatever it is that I'm making, which gives me sort of these, I don't know, bars or so of opportunity. Again, those will all paint because that selection is telling it to not pick up any paint outside of that area. So that subtraction option gives me tons of freedom to be able to creatively work with selections to build geometry. And in fact, the best way to think about using this is with the circle tool. So if you need to make some curvature of some kind, what you can do is perfect your selection first and then just paint that selection. You make a new layer here, wherever you want that sort of shape to be, which is pretty awesome. So that selection gives you a lot of opportunity. I would have to work with like gradients to make something that looks that way. I would have to work with like defining the shape or form first. Super fast, easy way to do it with just paint. If I know I'm not going to have to resize it or anything or change it or scale it, that's a great way to work as well. So using the selection to limit where my paint shows up. But let's say I didn't want to just have a full circle. Let's say I actually wanted like a ring. So how would I create a ring or a selection of a ring? Again, I want to have that sort of airbrushed painted texture because I think that's beautiful. But how do I do that? So actually I'm going to hold down the option key. This is a couple different steps here. See if you can follow them. Hold down the option key and click and drag. That will create a circle. I also know that if I hold down the option key again, it will draw the circle from the center. So let me back up here just 1 second. You can click and drag to draw a circle and an ellipse. If I want it to be a perfect circle, I'm going to hold down shift. There's going to be a lot of buttons I'm going to be clicking on the keyboard. So shift to be able to draw a perfect circle. You can see that it's drawing that circle from the top left-hand corner. As I drag it down, it's going to draw it from the top left to the bottom right. If instead I want it to draw from the center, I can hold down the option key. So again, option will allow it to draw from the center. Now it's sort of scaling that from the center. But if I want to move where that center point is while I'm still clicking and dragging, still holding down the option key so that it's drawing from the center, I can then hold down the space bar. The space bar will allow me to move that center point around so I can center it up in my composition. Then I can let go of the space bar to free transform it from the center again, still holding down the option key. Then I can also hold shift to make it a perfect circle. So a couple different key combinations. I'm hitting shift, option or alt, and the space bar and sort of interlocking those to fit them together. This is a little bit of a more complicated step, but it's also awesome. So I'm going to hold down the option key again. So to make a subtraction, I want to take out the center of the circle. I'm going to click and drag, but oops, you can see it's not drawing. It's drawing from the corner now instead of the center. So I'm going to actually let go of the option or alt key. It's still doing the minus, as you can see on my cursor. But then I'm going to also hold down the option or alt key again. And now it's drawing from the center. I can also then hold down shift, and that's going to make it a perfect circle. And look at this really beautiful ring shape that I'm able to make out of this. I can center up my center point if I hold down the space bar so it can move that around. This is a really beautiful way to make sort of ring shapes. There's that ring shape. You can go in and sort of paint over top of it. I have a few nice faded edges. Command J to duplicate layers, retransform my layers if I want to. Change their shape a little bit. Get some more unique shapes, which is pretty fun. So a great way to work in Photoshop or potentially Procreate to be able to interject some geometry into your design, whatever that design might be. And the idea here is, if I pre-transform these things, this may be like a perfect letter O that I can start building a font around. Sort of thin painted lines. It's pretty fun. Let's see if I can show you one that I was making up earlier. It's kind of some fun forms and shapes for different compositions and things. So different ways you might be able to work geometrically to be able to create some interesting letter forms. You can also, in Photoshop, similarly, work with the type tool. So for Helvetica for now, just retransform this font and make it larger. And let's say you wanted to subtract or add to this lettering, what would you do? Well, you can't quite make it outlines in here. So this is a painting or drawing space. So if I want to just put my name in here, but I want to change the shapes or form of some of these letters, you really sort of have to think about it a different way than you do in Illustrator. It's not a space where I can just like throw shapes around, see what I can play around with. You want to try and actually subtract some from this. So the best way to subtract from lettering is to add a mask. It's just this little circle in a square button. And then when I paint with black, anytime I paint with black, it's going to cover up portions of the lettering. If I use a hard edge brush, it will be a nice little like cut edge. So I can sort of take out that intersection of that letter. Let's increase my opacity. Brush. Subtract the scale here. If I click in one spot and then hold Shift and click in another spot, it'll draw a straight line. That's already kind of an interesting, that's kind of an interesting shape right there. I could even make a selection of that. Rasterize my layer. Now it is paint. To make a selection of this. My lasso tool. Make a copy and paste it. I've got a piece of that letter. It's kind of fun. So I can build with pieces that way too. It's a little bit more of like a copy paste feature, essentially. Using the mask to subtract, I could go in and add geometric shapes on top with my selections. Maybe let's add a little bit of like a curved crossbar here. Subtract that out to make a line. I drop that pink color. Kind of interesting shape for a crossbar potentially. Starting to change the form of that lettering. Just using the geometry of the curvature of that perfect circle, or by making rectangles, whatever you choose. A few different methods that you could use to create a few freeform editing shapes this way. So I'd love for you guys to try all of these things if you would like. The first thing you might try is to just go ahead and convert any type into shapes so that you can mess with it. And again, that's creating a type format, going to type menu, choosing create outlines. Now it shapes just like we were playing around with before, except that it's a font, so it's a simpler clicking process. You could find some interesting shapes in thefont.com. You can click around and change the points and things like that if you wanted to do that. Different way to change the shape there. The issue is just trying to be consistent with the line width. That should be consistent as you're working. Maybe I'll round one of the corners on all the letters. Do these two sides together so they match. Round these corners too. And essentially just using the white arrow tool, clicking on points, holding shift to select multiple points, clicking and dragging on these little white nodules there to be able to round the letters. Now it's my font. Different than it was. So try just subtracting from or moving the points around. Type menu, create outlines. If you're working on paper today, no worries, I got you. I have a suggestion for a way to think about these things. And that is to look at a font and see if you can systematically redraw what would it look like if these were taller. So the straight edge letters are pretty easy to imagine how you could add height. Whoa. But how can I add height to these more difficult letters? Well, drawing them is actually probably the easiest way. In the computer, it's a little bit more complicated. I can't just stretch this. It's not going to have the same width there. So I'm going to have to fix some of it. Square at the top. Square A. That way the line thickness is similar. I'll raise that crossbar just a little bit. Sign just a little bit. Fun.
It was like a few classes ago, there was something with deleted like unnecessary anchor points, like that were on the curve.
Yep.
How do you what key selection you can do when you want to keep the curve, but delete the anchor points over it.
Sure.
Unnecessary anchor points.
Yes. Great question. And in fact, I can probably delete this one right here and still have something similar. So yeah, what Tony's asking about is essentially when you subtract points here, sort of working with the point system. Here's an S, right? You can hit the A key or the white arrow tool to be able to see those points. I don't want to subtract a point, but if I just go to my straight pen tool and hit that subtraction, you can see it change the curve entirely. It's a completely different shape now. If you want to keep the shape, the tool that you actually need to use is underneath the pen tool. It's actually the delete anchor point tool. And it only works with this tool. It's the only way I've figured out how to get this to work. It doesn't work with a regular pen tool, I don't think. Yeah, try. Yeah, it doesn't work with a regular pen tool. It needs to be that subtraction. The hotkey for that one is actually the minus key. So I can hit the minus key to select that version of the pen tool. The version of this pen tool is actually only the minus. Then what you can do is actually hold the shift key when you hover over a point. So holding shift will tell the computer, hey, I want this to keep the line. And then when you subtract that point, it'll do a pretty good job of keeping that line.
So shift it while using the delete anchor point tool.
Yeah, and the hotkey for that one is minus.
Okay.
Yeah, great question. Really, really helpful to get rid of as many key points as you can. So I'm hitting subtraction or the minus or the dash key on my keyboard, holding shift and clicking on the points. It doesn't always do a perfect job. If there's no way for it to get rid of the line without having to lose some quality that way. Yeah, good question. This will take me a while to increase in scale. That would be way easier to do with paper. Bless you. Yeah, some things are much easier to do on paper than in the computer. So if you're trying to rescale fonts, try starting off with making things taller than they need to be. Look at a font. You could look up some on your phone if you want to, if you just got paper with you. Even just start with like a basic Helvetica, but how do you make like Helvetica taller? What would be the process? Choose a word. It does matter what letters you're working on, how those are going to turn out. And then if you're working in Illustrator, feel free to jump in, mess around with some fun fonts. See what you can do to simplify the process, make them consistent. Consistent line width. If all of the horizontal lines are thicker than the vertical lines, that should be consistent. And you can mess with the lettering that way. This one's starting to get a little bit of a taller, extreme version of the font. That S is going to be a challenge. The O will be a challenge. The O is just going to have to be more of an ellipse. If I make it a full circle, it'll just be way too big, although that might look kind of cool. Also made it too thick too, right? The line width is changed. So I might select these interior points and change their signs. Little unknown trick also, you can make selections of points and then transform the points that you select with your regular selection tool, the black arrow tool, which is pretty great. So I can actually click on these points with my white arrow tool. So A on my keyboard, click on one, hold shift, click on another, still holding shift, click on another, still holding shift, click on another. And then I have those as selection. I can actually just immediately switch over. V on my keyboard is my direct selection tool. And now it's not selecting the whole letter, it's just selecting those points, which means I can sort of free transform these now from the corner edge. Hold down the Option key to make them larger from the center. Hold down the Shift key to keep the proportions the same. So now I can try to match the line width there to increase the counter space in the O. I wasn't planning on making the O super large, but that's just a fun way to write, I guess. It's much more of a unique lettering already. This S is going to be a challenge, though. S's are always the toughest letter, to be honest, because it's just all curves. It's all competing curves going in different directions. Maybe if I just increase the size, but still that line width is too thick. So I'm going to have to thin the letter in some way. This might be an opportunity to do some outline work. So the S is a difficult one because I want to change the shape here. Let me make a copy of this over here. Let's talk about the outline tricks. We'll start introducing some of them, if you have a second. The outline itself can be the same color, but I'm going to change the color to the outline to something that's really easy to see. You can see here it's got an outline. If I increase the size of the line here, it's going to make it thicker both on the outside and the inside. If I go to my stroke panel options, though, there's a different way that you can choose what kind of line you want it to be. Do you want it to be only on the inside or only on the outside? And this only works, it does not work with type. You can't do this with lettering, it has to be a shape. But check this out, as a way to thin the letter out, I could choose the thinness that I want by setting the outline to the inside with my stroke panel, choosing the width of the line that I want it to be. Again, I'm not gonna have to mess with any of the points. I just need to let's look at my other letter and say, oh, is this the right width here? Should be a little bit thinner than that. So let me increase the size here. Maybe that, let's say that's a good thickness for the letter. Maybe 14, a little bit thinner. Now what I can do with outlines is right now it's a filled color, right? I've got black filled in, I've got blue on the outline color. If I go to the object menu and choose expand appearance, this feature will turn that outline into a shape. So now I've got those both separated potentially. Let's try that one more time. Select the letter, object, expand appearance. I think sometimes you also have to click again and choose expand again. See if it'll do it. Ungroup it together. There we go. I just needed to ungroup it. So now I have a blue outside edge, right? It's its own shape. It's also filled in. Now if I select both of them and choose the Pathfinder feature of trim or divide, you can overlap those shapes, right? So let's try divide here. I'll ungroup them, and then I can actually just delete the blue. And what I'll have left is that thinner letter. So I essentially made a thinner S for myself without having to work on any of the points. It may not be the perfect solution, but it's a fast way to get rid of some points there. Just a thinner version of that letter. I'd say it's maybe a little bit too wide. I can probably thin that out a little bit this way. Here we go. Got some tall letters, and that O is kind of dominantly too large, which is kind of fun, honestly. The A could use a little bit more work, but I'm not critiquing work. I'm just trying to get better at building. The process of building is such a useful tool because it can save you a lot of time, a lot of effort. We're just practicing today. I know we got spring break next week. Not going to give you homework. We're going to look at more functional methods of making, you know, the formalities of monogram design. We'll start looking at that on Wednesday in class, but let's just practice a few different processes and tools so we can get better at doing what we want. I think that letter A looks a little bit better. You know, not always are the crossbars going to line up, so even having that taller letter H is kind of working. Maybe I can make it a little bit shorter. Drag select over those interior points, hold shift, drag select over the interior points on the other side. I'll just shift that down a little bit. Looks better. I think the A looks a little bit too thin on the top. So I'll maybe make the counter space in the A a little bit shorter. Oh my gosh, these points are not aligned up. Quick little tool, go to the align panel. If you've not thought about using the align panel this way, highly recommend. Align can be a great way to line up points. So click on one point, hold shift, click on another one. I just want to align these sort of center aligned horizontally. There we go. One click, lined up. Super handy. And if you get bored of messing around with letters today, can't recommend enough trying to build your own Lego pieces to play around with. Happy for you to choose what process you'd like to mess around with things today. Jump into a font if you want to. Cut that font into pieces. Reconstruct those pieces to fit into a different letter forms. Working on sort of our knife or scissor tools in Illustrator today. Cut blocks this way using the Pathfinder feature. Honestly, this is probably the fastest way to cut things. There's other slice tools and stuff like that, but this is probably the easiest, in my opinion. You can take these shapes, rotate them around themselves. R tool, click, hold down the option, click and drag, let go, hit Command and D to duplicate that shape over and over and over and over. Select that whole mess of shapes that you just made. Cool kaleidoscopic effect. Already looks awesome. You know, if you just change that already by itself into outlines, you can see all those nice little lines and things. Maybe increase the line width a little bit. I mean, that's already cool. But if you select all those things, hit the divide feature, ungroup it, you're gonna have a ton of little shapes and things to play around with that you can build. With. Here's like a letter E. Real sharp little letter E. All right, I'm probably going to stop the recording there. Can I answer any questions about this process?